Hi, and welcome to Organizational Leadership 4000 Learning Module 2, the second part of the course on being a transforming self and self-transformation. Remember the learning outcomes for this particular reflective seminar. You're going to be critiquing and critically evaluating your assumptions and your values and past experiences, and you're going to be expressing your own self-awareness and engage in self-critique. Critique your own assumptions and beliefs. Make sure that you're measuring your own capacity for self-transformation, how you've learned to be an adaptable person in your work environment. And when you're taking a look at the idea of documenting your responses in situations and events that have shown reflection, make sure that you're thinking about that in terms of yourself, in terms of your own beliefs, and in terms of the wider beliefs in your community and context. Here's just a reminder of the literature focus for our particular course. These individuals' names will look familiar because you've dealt with them before in Organizational Leadership 3000 and 3050, but make sure that you're focusing on the last parts of each of their models of reflection that we've gone over during the course of the class. Each of them is giving us a theoretical structure or a model for how one goes through the process of reflective learning, and you're going to be focusing on the last phases of each of their theories. So, when you're taking a look at doing your assignments for the course, make sure that you're structuring them and referring back to the people who we have looked at, their theoretical models. Make sure that you're giving explicit reference to their theoretical models, and that you're showing that you're aware of what phase of their model you are focused on. So, for example, in Fiddler and Marino, they're talking about the idea of making a difficult decision and how that makes you stop and step back and reevaluate your assumptions. Remember this table. In Organizational Leadership 3000 and 3050, you were focused on the top part of the table and the questions like what was salient in the event and what took your interest in the event. By the time that you're in Organizational Leadership 4000, you've gone through that process, and now you're focused on the bottom part of this diagram, where you're looking at the idea of integrating a new understanding of the world into your experiences. So, when you're doing this, it should increase the likelihood that you are learning from the next event that you're going to go through, and it expands the possibilities for how you end up noticing new things the next time that you go through a learning event. So it gives you a chance for better decisions for action. It gives you a chance for trying to integrate new information and use new insights, use new schools of thought in how you will respond to a situation that you have to go through. This diagram is the one that talks about how you go through an event and then you have an experience that you reflect on about that event, and then you learn from that process. Part of the idea of Organizational Leadership 4000 is that you are really looking at this idea of what is meaningful learning, and you become adaptable in how you use your beliefs and how you use your feelings and emotions to address a new situation. So, when you're looking at the theories of Kolb, remember that we had talked before about the phases in Kolb's theory of assimilating new information. In this particular Organizational Leadership 4000 course, you are looking at the integration phase. So you're integrating new schools of thought. You are becoming able to transform and to adapt to new situations. This diagram is one of Kolb's diagrams. And you may remember that before we were focused on the bottom level of this diagram, where the self is undifferentiated and immersed in the world and acquiring information. And then the second phase was the specialization phase, where you are interacting with the self in the world. That would be like Organizational Leadership 3050. For this course, we are in the integration phase up at the top of this diagram. The self is a process. So the self is always adaptable. The self is always in the process of learning new things and being able to deal with other schools of thought that it's going to be confronted with. So transacting with the world in an active and transformative way, not being a passive receiver of information. This is another one of Kolb's diagrams, and in this case, remember, we were working our way from the top of the diagram down to the bottom. And when you're looking at the idea of having abstract conceptualization, it means that you've become someone who has learned specifics, information about how to deal with some particular situation in the work environment, and you're able to abstract and conceptualize key ideas out of it. It's kind of like you're going through the process of learning something new in the work environment and then eventually becoming so good at it that you can explain it to someone else and you can train someone else. Probably most of you have had that kind of a moment when you've been in your job and you've ended up having someone new who you are expected to train. Think about the way that you explain what you do. Think about the ways that someone might ask you questions about, okay, well, what's the reason why it's done this way? That's abstracting and conceptualizing. That's what this particular model of reflective learning is referring to. And then once again, remember Kolb's learning table. In our Organizational Leadership 3000 class, we were doing the column listed under the word acquisition. In 3050, we did the column under specialization. And now in 4000, you should be focused on the column underneath integration. So each of these different kinds of concepts, the idea of having appreciation for different schemes and different points of view, the idea of having different kinds of meanings and different kinds of concepts, appreciating why there may be different schools of thought about how something should be done. That's what this last reflective seminar is all about, that last column. So when you're looking at the column about concrete experience, make sure that you're thinking about how the movement goes across that table from the left to the right. Your first phases of reflective learning would have been on the left side of the column, and then by the time that you're Organizational Leadership 4000, you're working specifically with the right side of the column. Now, first of all, you're going to have to do some discussion, posting, and responses for this learning module. Make sure that you are keeping in mind the idea of different schools of thought and how you would see someone becoming a self-transforming learner as you deal with these questions. The discussion, posting, and response number 2 is a case study involving someone who we're calling Angela Murphy. Angela is someone who works in the automotive industry. She is somebody who is in charge of supplying parts for automotive work. So perhaps she's someone who works in an office that's attached to a warehouse. She's responsible for keeping a supply chain going of materials that people working in the warehouse will need for what they are building. When she's working in this kind of a field, she may not at first be aware that there are different schools of thought about how one should do supply chain management or how one should do purchasing for those materials that are needed for manufacturing. She's going to end up finding that out. She's going to be requested by her manager to take a look at a new theory called Kanban. And this is an actual real theory of supply chain management, and it was inspired by people at the Toyota Corporation in Japan. So when you're taking a look at this whole idea of how we do what we do in our working world, what does it mean if you're somebody who is able to adapt and research a new school of thought? That's what organizational leadership is all about. How can Angela respond to this in a positive way and learn about this new school of thought that she didn't know about before? In your discussion, posting, and response number 3 for this particular section of the course, you're going to be taking a look at the story of Bob Johnson. Bob Johnson is an educator, and he's been working for a long time as an educator. He knows a lot about classroom management. He knows a lot about what students need. But then he ends up hearing around 2004-2005 about some different ideas about assessment culture. And he's especially interested in what he's been hearing about the Commission on the Future of Higher Education, which was led by Margaret Spellings. And this is another item that's based on actual historical fact. So one of the things that you're going to want to do is talk about, well, how can Bob research this? How can he find out more about what this new theory of education is, about what this new approach is? How will he be able to integrate it into what he already knows about classroom management? Those are the kinds of things you want to think about in your discussions for this particular learning module of the class. When people are confronted with having a new school of thought that they need to get to know, what's the best way to try and research it? How would you go about finding out about these things? We purposely picked 2 case studies here that are real so that you can go ahead and try to find out more about them as well. Thanks very much again for taking the class. Take care.